Damien has always been a woman's man. When his psychologist listens to him, as he immerses himself in free associations, she learns where it all began. Damien remembers he is in preschool, in love with a girl, and all he wants is to feel her eyes on him. This is why he agrees to wear a Snow White costume. And what happens next changes the entire course of his personality development. Everyone laughs, even the girl he wants to impress. This story, and the consequences it results in, aren't the reason behind his first meeting with a psychologist. However, as he points out, he's here because of a very certain and technical difficulty he's been having lately. Instead of brushing his teeth for 3 minutes, he compulsively engages in that activity for half an hour. And if he doesn't do it, he feels extremely anxious. Following Damien throughout the rest of his afternoon, we see that he works for a marketing company. The kind of ideas he comes up with shed light on his misogynistic, chauvinistic personality. Objectifying women and acting like a confident, humorous alpha male, he seeks praise from his fellow men, but not from women. As we soon learn, his main hunting ground is a bookshop. Upon entering, he immediately gets to scanning the area, noticing the details of women's bodies and identifying future partners. A writer who is currently having a book signing here knows him very well. This is why he advises his assistant Alexandra to stay away from him. But the girl doesn't really need to be told. After having spoken with him, she already knows that he and she can only happen in some alternate crazy reality. It is not necessary to deeply analyze his behavior, since it is so clear what kind of douche he is. While walking with Christophe, the writer, in the next scene, he is so immersed in grossing out girls in the street that he smashes into a street pole and falls unconscious. Hilariously enough, he continues to flirt with paramedics as well. Once Damien manages to stand firmly on his legs, Lola, Christophe's wife, and her friend Sybil ride up to them. After a short conversation, the two groups go their separate ways, and suddenly, we notice a major change happening in the world. Both Christophe and Damien seem to be unaware of this so far, but they are starting to act feminine, while two women come out of a garbage truck nearby. Something feels off. Christophe's goodbye is extremely unmanly as well. He smooches Damien warmly and takes him aback for a second. Damien greets his cat, then immerses himself in rigorous teeth brushing and becomes a little too worried about his growing fat in the belly area. The next morning, after waking up in his pink, cushy bed, he discovers that all his clothes are different. All of them are colorful, and none of them are manly enough for him to wear proudly. Finally, after managing to find something at least relatively male-ish, he goes outside and gets hit on by a woman on a crosswalk. He is eaten up by women's stares in the office as well. Seeing him off with passionate, annoying gazes, the working girls act as if their minds are overflowing with testosterone, while Damien's male co-workers appear to be unusually soft and feminine. Also, he cannot help but notice that there are many more women in the office than men. His boss is now hitting on him, while her male assistant prepares coffee outside. At first, Damien doesn't care that his project is denied for nothing more than a gender bias. He even likes being hit on, and he doesn't feel uncomfortable beneath her table at all. This is all until, after countless sexual directives, he touches her leg and feels hair brushing against his skin. He jumps up immediately. Suddenly, all the boss's attitudes become annoying to him, and when he tries to protest to them, he is addressed as a weak, overworked person. The boss advises him to rest a little and feel better. Naturally, Damien fails to contain his anger, so he gets fired immediately. While trying to draw his anger into alcohol in the next scene, he notices another clue to the dramatic turn that the world seems to be taking. Two men in the bar are not served because of the way they are dressed. When they try to fight for their rights, they are further rejected and humiliated by a female bartender. It is obvious to Damien now that the gender roles are flipped. Running outside, he meets with his parents, and seeing them engage in opposite gender roles, he freaks out completely. After getting zero practical help from the psychologist, Damien decides to cure his sudden condition by the first thing that comes to his mind. Remembering that everything started after smashing his head, he returns to the same street and starts a street pole. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. In a few hours, Sybil calls him up and invites him to have a drink together tonight. The location that she uses for the date is a little off-putting. It's a strip club where men are the ones performing and waiting for women. Looking around, seeing this parallel reality, and listening to Sybil throw coarse compliments, Damien starts laughing anxiously and uncontrollably. Even though he feels like a secondary object on this date, he still agrees to have sex with her that night. But at the last minute, Sybil decides to call everything off. Her fires are immediately stomped out as she notices hair on his chest, saying that it's extremely dirty and animalistic. She stresses that she just cannot do it, and leaves his apartment abruptly. The next morning, he spends some time with Christophe and his family. The gender roles are flipped here as well. After a couple of comical conversations, Lola's water breaks, and she is ushered into the hospital, where another family member joins her family. Lola endures the pain courageously and acts indifferently when she hears Christophe's conversation with his boss, Alexandra. As it seems, now Christophe is her assistant, and since he cannot work for her in this moment, he recommends that Damien take his place temporarily. The latter doesn't have a job anymore. He remembers Alexandra's passionate lips as well, so without thinking much about it, he agrees. Slowly but surely, he seems to be conforming to his new role in society. Following that day, he takes care of his body, gets rid of excess hair, dresses neatly, and decides not to get angry at the intrusive stares in the streets. In the next scene, when he enters Alexandra's apartment, we see how much the situation has changed. This time, Alexandra is the one denouncing and objectifying him, looking down on him, and making him feel like a piece of meat whose only purpose is to be desirable. She shows him around his workspace, then leaves. Damien is disappointed. The only reason he accepted this job was to get closer to her. But as it turns out, with this job, it is almost impossible. Once he is left alone in the apartment, he observes the bookshelves and finds Jane Steinbeck's Mice and Women and Georgia Flaubert's Mr. Bovary. Gradually, as he walks around the area, he becomes more and more fed up. After the conversation with the housekeeper, and after checking all the boring tasks, he finally decides that nobody can live like this. Disgusted by his new role and the indifferent, unempathetic, and egotistic attitude of Alexandra, he decides to quit. Having no idea how to deal with this growing frustration, Damien writes Sybil that night and invites her over. Now that he has no excess hair, the woman agrees to hook up, but her explosive and coarse sexual energy drains in only a few seconds. Immediately after meeting her needs, she forgets all about Damien and, rolling over, receives a cat in her face. When Damien asks her to leave, she doesn't have a problem at all. The next evening, after her usual day, Alexandra notices a very unusual picture from her window. Seeing an extremely sorrowful scene of loneliness, she realizes that she's not that different from a man who has dinner with an imaginary partner. An inspiration comes to her then, and after writing down the first cliché sentence, she begins fantasizing about Damien. The title for her new novel pops inside her head as well. Her new book should be called I'm Not an Easy Man. To get some support, Christophe and Damien visit an activist group called Tits for Tats in the next scene. While conversing with the leader, they learn that the activists of this organization take part in performances that shed light on important gender issues. Damien, Christophe, and his newborn daughter are ready to join in. That evening, Damien hosts his parents in his apartment. Two noses are immediately put into his business. Both the mother and the father begin asking him questions about his recent relationships and marriage prospects, until the man begins steaming from frustration. Damien's so enraged that he finds himself craving soothing alcohol and sex. He finds Alexandra at a bar in the next scene and takes it as his task to lure her into bed. After a long and rigorous attempt, he somewhat even manages to excite her with how much he cares for his gender. But Alexandra is just playing the role of an excited person. Once they leave the bar, she is invited to go somewhere private, but she never takes advantage of drunk boys. Damien is mindlessly drunk. Gentlemanly, he is put in a cab and sent home, as if he is a person who could not account for his actions. In the next scene, we learn what Alexandra's motive was last night. As it turns out, she has recorded Damien's voice and is planning to use it in her new book. This is unfair to Damien, and perhaps even illegal, but the book about how to tame a craving masculist will be loved by the general population. The publisher loves the prospect of a new book that fights against the myth of female dominance, and she is ready to support Alexandra with everything she can. Alexandra, on the other hand, is definitely eager to strengthen her relationship with Damien. That day, the latter visits Christophe in his apartment and readies himself for a difficult conversation. After quitting his job with Alexandra, Christophe's reputation has been destroyed, since he was the one recommending him for the job. The man is furious with him for throwing away an opportunity like this and disintegrating his reputation in the process. Damien, on the other hand, sees how much of a conformist his best friend has become, surrendering in the face of growing humiliation from the women around him. Christophe averts his eyes from the fact that nobody really cares for him. These clashing views create the first conflict we see between best friends. It's interesting to see how it will be resolved. Later that evening, Damien is invited to a cocktail party at Alexandra's apartment. He speaks with the publisher, who makes a joke out of his masculist view and gets immediately annoyed by her position. She makes a straw man out of Damien's arguments and points out just how stupid it is to be upset when doors are open for you and drinks are poured in front of you for free. When he escapes the party together with Alexandra in the next scene, he puts all his flirting prowess to work. Taking advantage of this situation, the writer offers to go to a club named Reverse. The reality of reverse gender roles is still noticeable here, but for some reason, Damien prefers it over the outside world. When he expresses this view, he is told humorously that this is a gay bar. Alexandra finds it extremely funny, as she continues to laugh about this. But suddenly, Damien leans towards her in one quick motion and kisses her firmly, proving that he's as straight as an arrow. The two appear in Damien's bed in the next scene, immersing themselves in a foreplay that is supposed to blow wind to their fires of passion. They tell each other about their worlds. In Damien's previous existence, men were the ones who dominated society, while in Alexandra's world, women had the upper hand. Before taking her clothes off, she turns her voice recorder on secretly and heads back to fulfill her task of demasculizing Damien. So far, she's been extremely successful in this endeavor, and tonight as well, she carries out her purpose flawlessly. When she leaves him at the break of dawn, Damien is already deeply entangled in her game. That morning, he meets with Christophia's son, who's a ballet dancer. As it turns out, the boy has been having a problem with a girl in school and needs support. He contacted Damien for help. The man soon learns that the boy is being... But the idea that a male human can be too is so foreign to Damien that he fails to help the boy out properly. Later that day, however, after visiting Alexandra and being manipulated by her, he looks at himself in the mirror and finds a man he scarcely knows, staring at him with a confused gaze. Thanks to the growing desire for affection from Alexandra, Damien even agrees to iron her clothes. Alexandra's door was vandalized yesterday. Now, with yellow paint, the word "female pig" is written on it, and to get rid of it, she calls a painter. Damien is the one to have communication with her once Alexandra leaves, and he is the one who has to listen to her humorous outbreaks. The woman is clearly having a lot of fun, laughing at Damien and this whole situation. In the next scene, the couple goes shopping. Alexandra offers to buy him a watch, but after an extremely cliché conversation in which Alexandra tries to spoil Damien, the man breaks away, saying that he wants something different. His lover immediately understands what he wants. He wants commitment, and to soothe his visible frustration, Alexandra verbally expresses her full engagement in this relationship. Like confused tourists in Paris, they kiss each other in the street. Afterwards, Damien tries to mend his relationship with Christophe. He goes on and on about how sorry he is, and thankfully, his best friend accepts him back. Now Damien can express what has been going on in his mind lately to someone he trusts. As was already obvious, he is afraid of losing Alexandra. It sounds like obsession, especially in the light of his growing insecurity, but Christophe believes that it's love. As it turns out, he hasn't been very prosperous in that area of life, so he stresses that Damien should enjoy his relationship while he can, because at some point all will inevitably crush down. This monologue of his doesn't sound so crude when he adds that Lola has been cheating on him. All Damien can do is give him a hug. Later that day, wishing to get closer to Alexandra, he asks if he can read her novel. Instead of following this line of conversation, however, the woman decides to turn on her audio recorder and fire up a disagreement about gender roles. She needs new material for her novel, and day by day, she seems to be collecting it quite successfully. Once Damien is left alone in her apartment, he hears a knock on the door and opens it without much thought. A young man rushes inside quickly and goes towards her room, saying that he has left a ring in there. When Damien is asked who he is, he answers that he's a friend and receives a cynical laugh. Once the young man disappears behind the door, Damien sends Alexandra a text message about what is happening and receives a response to call the cops. Damien wants to do something more manly. However, spreading his shoulders, he opens the door and sees the young man painting the walls. When Damien tells him to stop, he immerses himself in an emotional monologue about how Alexandra used him. She treated him like an object, like something you can toss around. He knows all about her despicable personality, how she collects men like trophies, and how, literally, she manipulates them. It is all her fault that now this man is a hollow human obsessed and depersonalized. Damien is moved. He might end up just like this young man. He knows that Alexandra has a marble collection. And as the man stresses, each marble represents a man she has conquered. Dramatically affected by this episode, Damien's view of Alexandra changes. And in the next scene, He tries to address this issue with her. Testing her, he unexpectedly starts asking her questions about the marbles. And from her averted eyes and nervous laughs, he realizes that the young man was right. Now Damien knows that he has been nothing more than a trophy of flesh for Alexandra this whole time. He has no intention to continue this relationship, and no manipulative sentences or promises can change that. Once, he used to be an oppressor too, so he knows the ways in which it all works. He has fallen victim to her once, but this will never happen again. While enraged, Damien strolls the city streets and visits his psychologist. Alexandra lets her fury out on a punching bag. Trying to use this energy creatively, she attempts to write as well, but discovers herself unable to put down even a single sentence. Her plan isn't working, and her world is crushing down on her. The next morning, she brings her unfinished novel to her publisher and watches her become more and more delightful with it. The woman is extremely excited to read the rest of it and see how this stupid masculist is taken care of. This attitude makes Alexandra even more bitter. Until she tames the masculist in real life, she cannot write about it. As the publisher continues to be delighted, she gradually becomes more and more ashamed and resentful. This is why she proposes to change the topic of the novel completely. The publisher has no other option than to manipulate Alexandra with money and her sense of social superiority. The publisher pushes her so rigorously that we think Alexandra will surely surrender to her will. After the night of poker with her feminist friend, however, she calls her up and quits for good. Perhaps there are dramatic, sharp changes taking place within her personality. In the next scene, Damien is drowning in tears while watching a tragic romance when he hears someone knocking on the door. As it turns out, Christophe has kicked Lola out of their apartment, and now the woman is looking for a place to stay. Naturally, Damien gives his friend shelter and listens to her as she denies cheating. He won't be so easily deceived, however. After he forces the truth out of her mouth with his rigorous stare, we learn that the two have a huge history together. As it seems, they were once in a relationship. From Lola's perspective, it didn't work out because she was uncertain about her feelings. After discussing it at length, something changes in Damien. When Alexandra calls him up that night, he agrees to meet her the next morning. Proving that the love they feel towards each other, their gender roles blend in within each other and disappear. Instead of getting in the passenger seat after the door is open to him, Damien sits behind the wheel and drives to the hotel, which he reserved. They spent the entire day and night there. Fully immersing themselves in this experience, they forget about the outside world. Social standards, roles, responsibilities, and predispositions all disappear and give way to simple love. Once the night ends, they get into Alexandra's car once more, and after a few minutes, they hear a noise coming from the rear end of the vehicle. Once Alexandra pulls over and has one good look around, she discovers a flat tire and starts preparing to change it. Suddenly, a newlywed couple exits a church nearby, and without much thought, Damien starts speaking about it. He asks her a couple of safe questions about God and sin, but suddenly, another much more important question pops out of his mouth. He asks if she will marry him. He realizes the seriousness of it only after it is fully articulated, so to avoid frustration, the only thing he can do is change the subject abruptly and start walking away. After a couple of steps are taken, however, Alexandra says yes. And so, as wedding photos are taken nearby, they get engaged. That night, after listening to a lengthy conversation about how it is okay for women to cheat, Damien breaks the news to his father. The man cannot possibly be happier. This is the moment he's been waiting for his entire life. The next morning, Christophe and Damien join with the masculist activists and head over to the publisher's office to protest against matriarchy and toxic femininity. The morning is filled with positive energy and hope for the future. But when Damien runs into Alexandra's publisher, he hears about a secret that destroys his paradise. As it turns out, Alexandra is already married to someone. Hearing about this unexpected reality-breaking news, Damien quits the protest immediately and rushes towards Alexandra to learn the truth about the matter. When the door to her apartment isn't open to him, he gets the keys from a neighbor and gets inside. To his misfortune, the publisher turns out to be right. Alexandra is really married. Enraged, Damien turns the entire apartment upside down. This isn't the whole truth, however. In the next scene, while following Alexandra throughout her day, we understand that she even has a daughter, and the only reason she is still legally married is that her husband is continually refusing to sign for a divorce. This time, Alexandra informs him that she has filed the documents once more, and he will have to sign them. She wants to marry someone else. Returning home with her daughter, she discovers her apartment totally ruined. She understands immediately who the creator of this mess must be. So after her daughter leaves, she gets into her sports car and drives away. She thinks that Damien learned about her recordings and her unfinished novel. When she reaches his apartment building, she runs into Christophe and Lola, who tell them that they are going to Damien right now. He's mindlessly drunk, and some rough gals are picking on him in some bar. Of course, Alexandra paces after them. Once they reach the bar, one of the girls is trying to on Damien, while a couple of others are laughing about it at the counter. Lola beats them up and runs after them outside, while Alexandra enters the bathroom and finds a woman lying on the ground while Damien is raising his trousers. As it turns out, he forced the woman away from him, and in this emotional state, he has even less intention to speak with Alexandra. The latter, however, still starts explaining herself. She mentions her lie, her novel, and her recordings, totally unaware that her words are having an opposite effect. Damien's disappointment and anger double after hearing that not only is she married, but she's been recording their conversations secretly and writing a book with them. Their argument soon turns into a physical fight, and it all ends with both laying unconsciously on the floor. In the next scene, Alexandra wakes up in an ambulance. Immediately after returning to her senses, she forces herself out of the vehicle and exits through the street we are already very familiar with. This is the exact street where Damien once banged his head into a street pole. Walking through the streets of Paris, Alexandra becomes more and more confused. The world has changed. She has woken up to a completely reversed social reality. Even in this world, however, Alexandra and Damien quickly find each other.